strong advocate on a broad range of issues within the human rights agenda. During the formative years of the UN, it was none other than Dao Phat, back as the fourth president of the General Assembly at the time the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. Australia's record is non-spotless, however. At our recent Universal Periodic Review of Interventions, around half of the recommendations concerned Australia's asylum seeking policies. Many of our peers, many member states called for an end to turnbacks, offshore processing, and mandatory detention, particularly for children. In June 2015, Australia announced that we're running with the UN Human Rights Council. 2 seats are on offer. Our closest rivals are France and Spain, both makes them very strong competitors. Our pillars are the formulation of our platform is based on gender equality, governance, freedom of expression, the rights of indigenous peoples, and strong national human rights institutions and capacity building. We can think of no better person to address this forum, Australia's role in the United Nations, particular regard to human rights, than our next speaker. She's the president of the Australian Human Rights Council. She's formerly the dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Sydney. Her career has combined academics and international legal practice. The author of many books. Would you please welcome the indefatigable advocate for human rights and injuries.
Thank you very much, Murray. Can I begin in this wonderful Customs House by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet? I think it's always such a privilege to meet here in historic building to remind us of our origins and, of course, of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I have been really thrilled to be invited as we part of this New South Wales UN Association meeting. I've been a great fan of not only of international law but the United Nations system since I first stumbled into my first international law lecture at the University of Melbourne. So I'm speaking to you as somebody who's absolutely committed to the UN processes. And I can say really that over nearly 50 years since I was first admitted as a lawyer, I have seen huge advances over those 50 years and do speak with considerable enthusiasm for a slow but nonetheless effective process of integrating human rights into the United Nations system processes. I very much enjoyed the last discussion, the panel discussion, and particularly the point that's made over and over and over again, and that is that ultimately, if we are to have the political support for the objectives of the United Nations, and in particular human rights, we need an educated public. And I think there's no doubt that that is what we have to work on, and I was interested in the comment that maybe in relation to Indigenous recognition, we have to look to a 10-year education program. We know so little about human rights law in Australia, and almost nothing about our constitution. And that it's very, very hard to get an intelligent public debate on these questions. So I'm very pleased indeed to see Sydney Boys High School here. You're just the group that we need to talk to and to engage with actively and critically in Australia's role in the United Nations. I think you'll all be aware that we've been in something of a period in which the UN has not been respected within Australia, where the views of the Human Rights Council, of the Human Rights Committee, and the entire, particularly the treaties human rights regime, has not commanded respect at the senior leadership political level. But we've seen a transformation in the sense with the achievement of a seat on the Security Council. It has changed minds, and it's brought Australia back into thinking a little more about what role we can usefully play within the United Nations system. Well, I've been asked to speak in particular about how Australia can engage more fruitfully with the UN on human rights in light of our bid for a seat on the Human Rights Council, encouraged one assumes by the very significant and fruitful role that we play on the Security Council. But also to talk about the generally poor assessment of Australia at the second Universal Periodic Review by 104 nations in Geneva over the last few months. And I've been very actively engaged with that, and I'll explain why and how, but was engaged both in the last November statements by 104 States, and then with Australia's response and comments in March again in Geneva this year. But before I get to the Universal Periodic Review, what I'd really like to do is to tell you a little bit about my own observations of Australia's commitment to human rights and to the United Nations system. Because unless we understand what I see as the exceptionalist and now isolationist approach by Australia to human rights, we really can't understand why we take the approach we've done to the Human Rights Council and to the Universal Periodic Review. So perhaps I could begin with something that I think you're all very aware of, and that is that Australia has been historically a very good international citizen, both in supporting the human rights regime in particular, and the United Nations Charter and the whole UN multilateral system in general. We've been extraordinarily committed from the time of the great Jessie Street in 2011 and the creation of the League of Nations that we all know, of course, failed ultimately to prevent war. She was a remarkable Australian who managed to pull together the women in the League, and although the League and the Covenant failed, she was very active in ensuring that sex discrimination was to be banned in the newly negotiated Charter for the United Nations. She was a remarkable leader and a woman whose memory I think we need to keep fresh and alive in Australia. But of course she was followed by the remarkable H.B. Evatt, the rather irascible, strong-minded and brilliant lawyer who represented Australia in the negotiations for the United Nations Charter at Dumbarton Oaks in 1944. He had the foresight in 1944 to argue strongly against the veto power. And we know, of course, that veto power has been translated into the power of the 5 nuclear weapon states, and we know what's happened as a consequence. We know from the discussion this morning that the blockages to the veto is really preventing the United Nations from meeting the ideal of being fit for purpose, which of course is an underlying question for this conference today. He fought against that veto. He lost, but he nonetheless got a number of other provisions of the Charter, including one that we forget to mention in any context, and that is that human rights were seen as absolutely fundamental to peace and security. So when the point was made this morning that unless a matter is related to peace and security, it may not be dealt with by the Human Rights Council, we're perhaps not understanding fully that human rights are integral to every aspect of peace and security. And that was very much the view of those that drafted that charter in 1944 at Dumbarton Oaks. Now, Evatt also then went on to be invited by Eleanor Roosevelt to draft the terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, one of the most powerful human rights instruments in international legal history. He fought for many of the phrases that appear in that declaration, and most importantly was President of the General Assembly in 1948 when the declaration was adopted without a single negative vote. And I'm told that we achieved that, he achieved it, by sheer force of personality in making sure that those states that weren't so comfortable with the declaration agreed to abstain rather than to stand against it. And what we now know, all these years later, is that that Universal Declaration is still the foundation document on which the raft of new treaties have subsequently been negotiated. The Genocide Convention, also one in which Dr. Evatt played a significant role, but from then on, that legacy that Jessie Street and Dr. Evatt gave to Australia's role in the international legal environment was picked up by successive governments across political persuasions for the next 45 years. And so we saw the raft of agreements, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic and Social Rights, the critically valuable Racial Discrimination Convention, Sex Discrimination Convention, and ultimately the 96th Disability Convention, Refugees Convention, Convention Against Torture, and of course the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we can see Australia's engagement very strongly involved in negotiation, in producing drafts. It's a marvellous technique for lawyers always to produce a little draft, because you've got a much better chance of being engaged in what it finally looks like. Marvellous engagement by Australia, right up into the Rome Statute and the creation of the International Criminal Court. So we can see, if you like, a trajectory on the graph. We were able to do that, where Australia has played this very, very significant role. But then we come to the beginning of the new millennium, and we see an entirely different environment. You might recall in 2001, we see the misstatement about children overboard in an asylum seeker issue. Tampa sails into Australia's territorial waters, and within a few weeks, we see the 9/11 attacks on the Pentagon and the Twin Towers. And pretty well from that moment on, if we want to place a marker in history, we've seen a rejection by political leadership in Australia of the key principles of the United Nations system, particularly with regard to human rights. And that is reflected in what I see as the exceptionalist approach to human rights in Australia, and an over-dependence on a malfunctioning parliament. Now let me explain what I mean by that. They're strong words, but I do stand by them. We are the only common law country in the world that does not have a Bill of Rights. Almost all civil law countries have Bills of Rights as well. Now you know very well that Bills of Rights in countries do not solve human rights problems necessarily, but they do provide foundational documents that can be used by the courts to ensure that governments act consistently with fundamental rights. So we're the only country in the world that does not have a Bill of Rights. You might have noticed that Queensland, a legal constitutional committee, has just recommended to the government that they embark upon a Charter of Rights. And I was rather intrigued by the question in the last session, what about the role of the states? Curiously, we seem to be seeing much more action by the states, Victoria, the SEC, the Territory, and now Queensland, in arguing that it's time now to be looking at a Bill of Rights to protect Australia's rights of peoples and, of course, to implement the international treaties to which we are party. Now, that point then is important. No Bill of Rights. But then we look at our Constitution, and you'll know that we have very few protection for human rights in our Constitution either. We've got the right to vote, we've got a right to be compensated if our property is taken from us, and we have a right to freedom of religion. A very strong position at the time of the founding fathers of our Constitution, that we would have never have an established religion, and we would have freedom of religion. A point that I think in the public debate today, it needs to be reinforced. We are quite exceptional, of course, in having that strong constitutional protection, but consolidated by decisions of the High Court. So very few constitutional provisions, no Bill of Rights, but tragically, although we have signed and ratified the international treaties on human rights, they have not been implemented into Australian legislation. So the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Economic and Social Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, even now the Refugees Convention, have not been implemented as part of our domestic law. And that is in a nutshell, one of the greatest problems that we have in the Australian Human Rights Commission. Because our job is to promote human rights according to our statute. And those rights are defined by international treaties that are not part of our local law. So when we go to the High Court of Australia, to the Federal Court, or I go to a minister and say, certain policies in Australia breach our international human rights obligations, I can be met quite accurately with the argument, that's all very interesting, but the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the Rights of the Child, is not direct part of Australian law. Parliament has not enacted these provisions, so that if we go to the High Court, for example, to complain about the mandatory and arbitrary detention of asylum seekers, the High Court in the M68 case, rather boringly titled, but nonetheless important decision, the High Court says offshore processing and removal of those seeking protection in Australia to another country is a valid exercise of the external affairs power and the aims of power. Now let's contrast that with a decision about 6 or 7 weeks later of the full court, the unanimous court of the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court. That court said the detention of people on land asylum is contrary to our constitution. It's contrary to a provision in our 1975 Constitution that all citizens of the country are entitled to liberty, and the unanimous court determined that that means a right to be free unless you are charged with an offence and given a trial. Now that provision, as you will know, and I hope those of you from Sydney High School know, that there in this remarkable document, Magna Carta, we celebrated the 800th anniversary just last year, in the middle of the provisions about the rights of widows on deaths of their husbands, and feudal dues, and the size of a glass of wine, and the breadth of a piece of cloth, in the middle is this remarkable provision. No man may be detained arbitrarily without charge or trial by his peers. This is not an invention of contemporary international law. These are core provisions of civilized legal societies across all legal cultures, as a matter of fact. Now, so we have an extraordinary contrast of a new developing country with very significant problems, but with a constitution that allows the court to reach decisions about human rights that we would see are consistent with international law. But in Australia, we do not. And we consistently get decisions by our High Court to say the High Court is bound by Parliament. And when Parliament passes laws, migration laws, counter-terrorism laws, bikie laws, laws which infringe freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and privacy laws in particular, and of course there can be the interests of the child. There's very little you can do legally in Australia other than come in at various, often bizarre angles, to the Federal and High Court, and sometimes you get an outcome, but usually you do not. And this is because of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. In Australia, we say, we place our trust not in bills to pass, not in legislation, not in international obligations. We place our trust in Parliament. Now, I'm quite sure if I say to most people, we place our trust in Parliament, we'd say, well, that makes sense. It's a representative democracy. We vote for our parliamentarians, and we hopefully get those parliamentarians to stand up for human rights. But the tragedy over the last few years is that Parliament has not done its job. The Parliamentary Scrutiny Committee for Human Rights is divided down party lines, and indeed reports after the relevant legislation has already been passed. And we have an opposition that on these critical questions has broadly agreed with the government in power, whichever it is. So we've had a malfunctioning Parliament that has not been able to stand up for these rights. Well, now it's in that context that I come to really the key point of my speaking to you today, and that is the Human Rights Council and the role of Australia in responding to the Universal Periodic Review. Now, I should explain to those who perhaps haven't necessarily followed this closely. We've had a Human Rights Commission for many, many years, and it has been mercilessly criticised, quite often for good reason. It didn't succeed in the way that had been expected, and it was damaged by criticism, as I say, much of it justified. And the United Nations then agreed to reform the process and to create the Human Rights Council. And in my view, the Human Rights Council has been a modest success thus far, and I personally believe that we should support its efforts. I think comments that it is ritualistic are not helpful, and what I'd like to do is explain to you my perspective of what I've seen of the work of the Human Rights Council and why I think we have to stand behind it as a nation to support its work. What the Human Rights Council did is to create the process of a universal periodic review. And you'll all know that the United Nations can only be as strong as the members allow it to be. So there's a lot of public criticism of the UN, and it's always being asked if it's fit for purpose. One answer is it's fit for the purpose that the states that created it allow it to have. So we have to work in a realistic political environment, but to work with the grand aspirations of the United Nations Charter. Now what happened here was the Council decided that a universal periodic review by peers of other states would be a way of generating some level of international scrutiny of human rights behavior. But it was to be every state within the Human Rights Council, I think 145, and each state was to have the right to critique and make recommendations about the human rights practices of other states. So it wasn't bodies like ours, the Australian Human Rights Commission, or it wasn't Amnesty International, or a university academic, or a political activist. It was states reviewing other states' human rights practices. Very limited, one might say, but I see it as a very important, transparent exercise in which we have that grand arena of the Palace of Justice in Geneva, on banks of Lake Geneva, states gathering to critique each other's human rights behaviour. And that is an extraordinary phenomenon, to watch it, to be part of it. And I have to say, without being too sentimental, for me, to sit there surrounded by 145 states, courteously, but firmly, making points about the human rights practices of other states, knowing full well that they are subject to criticisms themselves, was a very, very encouraging and heartwarming experience. It was not passionate, it was not polemical, it was not overtly political. In many instances, it was extremely courteous and, in my view, very impressive. Now, what are the outcomes? Disappointing. But nonetheless, it's an important step. And also, we're at the very early stages of the Universal Periodic Review. Australia had its first review in 2011. And a number of, it happens every 4 years, and Australia was subject to 140 recommendations by states in 2011. Many of them migration and asylum seeker issues, but that wasn't quite the topic of the day at that time. Many issues concerning Indigenous Australians, particularly the incarceration rates of Indigenous Australians. 48% of those held in juvenile detention facilities throughout Australia are Indigenous. 48% of young people held in juvenile detention centres are Indigenous. In the Northern Territory, something like 96%, and I'm told I'm understating it, but something like 96% of those held in prisons in the Northern Territory are Indigenous. Now this issue is taken up pretty well every time within the international system, as indeed it should be. The other issue that comes up quite frequently, and did then, was violence against women and children, and we all know how that issue has become such a dominant one over subsequent years. My point was that in 2011, the government accepted 90% of the recommendations made in relation to Australia's human rights policy. So it was a very strong, in principle, engagement with the process. But what happened was that 4 years later, it was clear that we'd only complied with 10% and partially complied with another 60%. But when you look at partial compliance, it might have been nothing more than a discussion of an issue with a government official. So I think it's fair to say that after those first 4 years, the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Australian government was somewhat surprised that the 4 years had gone so quickly, but very little had been done to implement the recommendations that they agreed to accept. So there was a lot of rapid movement in the weeks leading up to the Universal Periodic Review process, the second one, in November last year. The Australian Human Rights Commission, as I think most of you will know, is an independent government agency. Now that might sound like a contradiction in terms to many of you. We're paid by the taxpayer, but we rest our powers on legislative powers passed by Parliament, of course, and we have statutory terms of office which give us a level of independence to speak as accurately as we can in monitoring Australia's compliance with human rights. If we have time later, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the other functions we have. But one is that we have an independent legal status to speak to the Human Rights Council about Australia's human rights record. So Australia can put its view about what it's doing, but we are entitled to make a statement in the public arena as well. So that is a huge step forward in terms of understanding the legal status of organisations that are not states. Although we are, of course, a government agency, we comply with Paris Principles of Independence, and to a large degree, Australian governments have respected that independence. Well, what we did was we knew that for this process to be successful, diplomats representing their respective countries had to be aware of what the positions were in Australia. And what we did was to hold meetings with the diplomats in Canberra. And this just gives you an idea. We invited the diplomats in the Canberra Diplomatic Corps to come along and hear us talk about what we thought was Australia's response to the first Universal Periodic Review and the issues that we thought would be helpful if states took up as a matter of diplomacy. And we were astonished that 53 countries with representatives in Canberra came along to that briefing session, and several others, particularly the Nordic countries and Europeans, asked for separate briefings on asylum seeker policies, indigenous policies and violence against women. So there was a very strong engagement. Now, of course, they didn't tell us what they were going to say eventually, but they then advised their governments back in their diplomatic services, and they then presented their arguments in November last year. Now, what happened was that 104 states spoke in alphabetical order to the gathering of about 145 states in this Geneva auditorium. And it's a fascinating thing. Each state has 1 minute and 5 seconds to put their argument. Now, you might think that that is ludicrous, but it actually isn't, because when you've got 1 minute and 5, you write your remarks, and you are concise and clear and accurate. And if you go over 1 minute and 5 seconds, the microphone system cuts out. So you cannot go on with a comment or make a diatribe or anything of that kind. Once you've got your time, boom, down it goes, and the next one starts. So it was very orderly, but as I said, it was courteous and very exciting for me to watch it. Each state would probably spend 20 seconds on courtesies. Thank you, Australia, for making the report. We're delighted that you made significant progress on for example, the National Disability Insurance Scheme. A huge advantage, a step forward for Australia. We should recognise that, and I certainly do. But other states were well informed and they knew we'd done that. Very, very positive remarks about engagement on women and violence and the astonishing level of deaths. It's common, it's a global problem, it's hardly included to Australia, but nonetheless, there was a recognition that there are now budgets being committed to responding to these questions. So 20 minutes on some really quite courteous, pleasant, respectful remarks, acknowledging where Australia has moved forward. The remainder of the time, 85 seconds, no, I've got my maths wrong, 45 seconds was spent on what they saw as the critical problems. And this is what became interesting. And there's a picture of what it looks like visually. There's this extraordinary ceiling, which really got to see, believe. Now, this shows you, and you can only see the general principle, that the biggest issue that was raised by the majority of states was asylum seeker policy and offshore processing. The second biggest was indigenous rights issues, by a fairly small margin, and the next was violence against women and girls. So the issues haven't changed, but the power of state after state after state raising the question of asylum seeker policy and offshore processing was really something that was not reported in the Australian press or really respected subsequently. There was a deep and abiding concern that Australia is the only country in the world that mandates indefinite detention of asylum seekers, including families and children. And we know, of course, that I and many, many others have spoken out against this, and we have, of course, the government has responded. There are no children now in detention in Australia, but sadly another 50 is still on the route. Now, what Australia did at this, in response to those points being made by the States was to say there were 290 recommendations made, and Australia technically accepted about half of them. But it did so on the extraordinary basis that in relation to the recommendations, Australian law already complied with those recommendations, including asylum seeker policy. So, astonishingly, the argument was that our asylum seeker offshore processing and mandatory detention policies comply with international law. Now, one of the things I've learned in this job is that you can say black is white, and in the end people start to believe black is white. You can say that we're in compliance with our international obligations, and politicians keep saying it. It's simply wrong. And more people have to be prepared to stand up and challenge it. But you can see what was done here. Technically, they said, oh, we accept half of them, because they're already Australian law and we're in compliance with international law. The other half were nearly no to them. So you could almost draw the conclusion that overwhelmingly the recommendations of that very serious and respectful process was pretty much rejected by Australia. But the critical points are that also the Australian government did make some positive agreements. And one was that it would work towards ratification of OPCAT, the Optional Protocol and Convention Against Torture. Now, that we haven't ratified for many, many years. As I say, we've ratified almost all agreements, but we haven't ratified that one. And the Australian government, I do believe, is in good faith working towards ratification of that. If we were to achieve ratification of OPCAT, it will give us a national monitoring system of all detention centres, not just asylum seeker migration detention facilities, but something that's become increasingly worrying to the Australian Human Rights Commission, and that is the detention of those with cognitive disabilities who are not fit to plead to criminal trials, those who are held because they've had long-term sexual offences against them, or increasingly people like the 501 visa cancellations, our New Zealand cousins and Brits who are being held on Christmas Island in their hundreds. All of these facilities, and juvenile detention facilities and prisons, where we have such high indigenous incarceration, all of those will become subject to a proper national monitoring system and subject to United Nations supervision. So it's a big step, but it's one that I see would be one that helps us to meet some of the major problems that we're seeing in Australia. The administrative detention of thousands of people and the detention of some in ways that's manifestly discriminatory and unacceptable. So that is a huge step forward if the Australian government can achieve OPCAT ratification. The other agreement was that they would, again, using this very soft language, they would work towards consultations to consider a national business plan to ensure that business works consistently with human rights. So that, again, if it were to succeed, is very helpful. The government has also agreed to work with the Australian Human Rights Commission on a process of monitoring compliance with the recommendations of the UPR process. So rather than realising 4 years from now that nothing has been done, we will be able to work fruitfully with the government, and I really believe that we can and will do that, so that there are no surprises 4 years from now, and we've got a better story to tell the United Nations. Now that then brings me to my point, my key point, and that is that the UPR process has been working quite well. It's a respectful one. Some states are part of the Human Rights Council, states whose records on human rights are disgraceful, but they are in the tent, if you like, they're part of the system. They are under increasing pressure to meet human rights standards. Let's take Qatar, for example, with its hosting of the FIFA soccer final. To do that, they've got to start putting in place human rights standards. And I believe that they will at least meet some level because of international pressure to do so. So it's slow, it's frustrating, some of it is formulaic, some of it is purely for the cameras without substance behind it. All of that is true, but I can honestly say from my perspective as an international lawyer that these are steps forward, slow, careful, frustrating, but nonetheless we are making advances. And so for that reason, I would very strongly support Australia's attempt to become a part of the Human Rights Council. We will need to be elected by a majority of the members of the General Assembly, and of course it's a big question as to whether we will get those votes. Will our behaviour in relation to asylum seeking policy and Indigenous matters count against us, or will our long history, very briefly discussed, from Jessie Street to Doc Everett through Gareth Evans and others promoting core principles, will that stand us in good stead, along with what I think is an almost unimpeachable record of contributing to peacekeeping efforts throughout the world since 1948. In my view, we deserve a seat on the Human Rights Council. I think it's far better for us to be in the system than out of it. It is frustrating. We will be dealing with countries whose records are totally unacceptable. But I also believe that the only way of improving global standards of human rights is to work creatively and doggedly with those states, using sport if necessary or any other mechanism to ensure that we have international human rights standards. So thank you again for listening to me for so long. Let's hope we've got some time for some questions. And please keep up your work through the UN Association and through New South Wales and through the schools to promote an understanding of the UN system and particularly of the human rights standards that Australia plays such a strong role in creating. Thank you very much.
Short, and we'll try if we can for one or two questions, okay? Which would be great. First one, I'd love to pose, if we are successful in that bid for the Human Rights Council, what would you say would be the right next evolutionary step from these reviews? How would you see that process improving?
Well, I think I'd like to see a stronger means of the Council to respond to states that fail to meet standards. But more positively, I'd love to see the Human Rights Council focus on best practice, so that if a country has done something that's compliant with standards, creative, exciting, with government support, why not praise them so that we've got best